cares, you know?
Hitler has captured the nation's imagination, Dietrich.
Bravery is a rare commodity. You will go to England as our spy.
What good is the church if it doesn't speak for the victims of the state?
The church's job is to kindle peace, peacefully.
Oh, you mean silently?
I need you to understand that your life will not be the same after I speak these words. We have devised a plot to assassinate the Führer. Guide our hands. Guide our trembling hands.
God sent Germany a true savior!
Our silence in the face of evil is itself evil.
Words aren't words anymore, Dietrich. They're nooses, bullets. This is a trigger that cannot be unpulled.
Will God forgive us if we do this? Will He forgive us if we don't?
Well, there you have it, folks. This is Jeff. How are you? Good afternoon. Got my guest, Dinah Dye, with me today. And that was one of the previews for the movie Bonhoeffer. Dinah happens to know quite a bit about Bonhoeffer. I was actually introduced to Bonhoeffer several years ago when I watched one of her video presentations about his life. And this was shortly after, I guess, Dinah, you, I don't know how it happened where you actually met Eric Metaxas, but welcome to the broadcast, and please tell me how that all happened for you. When did this begin for you?
Well, sure. This is a subject near and dear to my heart, so it's great to be on here talking about it. And we both just seen the film, and we are, of course, recommending it highly. So I think Eric Metaxas wrote his book, Bonhoeffer, Prophet, Spy, Martyr, Pastor, Prophet, Martyr, Spy, something like that. Yeah. And I believe it was in 2011. And I read it shortly after it came out because I've always been interested in, and believe it or not, his name is pronounced Bonhoeffer, which nobody pronounces because we're all American and we say Bonhoeffer. But yeah, I think it came out 2011. I read it, cover to cover. It's only 600 pages, a little light reading, before you go to bed. And I was just blown away. I felt that it was the definitive work on Bonhoeffer, having read lots of different versions about his life. And you have to understand, a lot of sort of theologians, leftist type theologians, had gotten a hold of Bonhoeffer's life and kind of pegged him into a hole of pacifism and had a view of him that I didn't really think was very accurate. And so Eric Metaxas' groundbreaking work and research, just incredible. So I think about 2017 is when I decided, because things were going off the rails in our own country, and it was really, I could see all the parallels, and I thought I really need to take the work that was in the book and try to make a video series and wake people up, because this was where we were headed. Like I said, I think it was 16 or 17. I'm not exactly sure. It was in December. And did a 9-part series on his, based off the book. And it was just very sobering. And I can't even believe now, at the time, I didn't actually, I hadn't the effort was to wake up the church and wake up people, but I honestly, in my mind, didn't believe it was ever gonna happen, right? And then we end up, under the former administration, and I'm going, "Oh my gosh, it's all here. Look at the anti-Semitism and look at the condition of the church post-COVID," all of that stuff. So it was very prescient. I was just blown away by all the similarities. So a few years after I had already produced the DVD and was out for sale, I was at it was a banquet in Albuquerque, and it was for Steve Collins as the archaeologist for the Sodom and Gomorrah dig. Apparently, Eric and Steve were quite close, and so he was invited to be the keynote speaker. Well, that was a school I had attended, so I went to the banquet. And before the meal, actually, and people were just sort of, hovering around, nobody, doing much. I spotted Metaxas and went over, and I had a chance to talk to him for about 15 minutes before no one even knew who he was. It was kind of cool. What was interesting is that, and I handed him the DVD that I had made, and it was interesting because at a couple of days before he came out to Albuquerque for the banquet, he had just gotten really attacked and criticized for his Bonhoeffer book and for his stand about it. And so I show up and I hand him the work that I had done and just praised him for the amazing book that he had written and how profound it was and the effect it's having. And this DVD that I'm doing it was on Israel TV network at the time, going out to how many untold millions. And it just really perked his spirit. I could tell he was just really overjoyed to hear that, because he was kind of down about, what was going on. Now that's been at least 5 or 6 years. So we fast forward. I have been waiting for the film for 12 years approximately. And Eric was not involved in the making of the film. His book was read by the producers and directors, etc. And they obviously tapped into it because I recognized quite a few things in it. But he didn't have any say. He wasn't part of the team that put the film together. But I would highly recommend anybody who hasn't read his book. In fact, I'm feeling that I need to go back and reread it because it's all here. Like, we really are here. But the church has just been silent on anti-Semitism all around the world and what we've allowed to happen in the Middle East, etc. We're way past time pushing back.
Dina, when I went to the movie, because I watched your series, I didn't know anything about Dietrich Bonhoeffer. I knew enough about the Holocaust and things of that. Actually, it was several Jewish friends down in the Portland area that kind of gave me the inside reality of what the Holocaust was. I remember saying to a Jewish woman, this is a side note, I remember saying to a Jewish woman, well, what about slavery? And she rolled up her sleeve and showed me, she showed me the numbers. She was in a concentration camp. She was elderly, and she says, you didn't corner the market on abuse or something like that. I can't remember exactly. And that's when I realized, because I was trying to get my little slavery thing in there. And she said, you don't own the abuses of people or something like that. Anyway, through the Jewish synagogues down in the Portland area, I remember I'd walk in there and I swear these women would circle me thinking, does he have a bomb? Or all this kind of stuff, right? And I finally said to a group of women, I don't have a bomb. And they started chuckling from that moment on. And these are very liberal Jews.
Right.
But from that moment on, I could sit and listen to their stories and hear some of their stories from the children born of the Holocaust people. So, they welcomed me in other words. And
well, I've always had an affinity for this because, my family, for Jews, there's, it's before the Holocaust and after the Holocaust. Like the Irish, it's before the potato famine and it's after. So that's the marker for everything. That's the filter by which they see everything. My uncle Max was in a concentration camp. He came back with the numbers and came on his arm and came back as damaged goods. And, that My dad served in World War II. He drove ambulances in Europe and Belgium and Holland. He was part of the deliverance from Dunkirk. He was in the Italian campaign. So this was always ever present in my life growing up. So it was just natural when I read about someone like Bonhoeffer and what his life it's just an incredible life. And he wrote voluminously about the things that happened to him, and to see and read about his own personal evolution, just as you saw him grow and understand what he was up against, and understand that the Jewish people were the apple of God's eye, and what was, obviously what was happening in Germany. And like I said, it's just, we're here. We're right back. We shouted never again, and we're right back where we were in pre-World War II.
When I walked into the movie theater, and I went and saw the movie last Sunday, I walked into the movie with a heavy heart because I knew the story. I knew the outcome. So as I'm sitting there watching the movie, I wasn't there to criticize it. I was there to see what they produced. And I think you do yourself a disservice to not go see it.
Absolutely.
But I had a friend, a very good friend of mine. He called me and he said, "Don't go see the movie." He didn't know that I'd already seen the movie. And I said, "Why not?" He said, "Well, it doesn't build up. It doesn't tell you why he did all the things you did." And I could see this coming from this particular friend, why he would think that. He wants the background. He wants all of that. So he just didn't feel like the movie made a lot of sense. Then I shared my take with him after letting him know that I saw the movie. And of course, he agreed with that. And my take was, it just basically, it solidified one more nail in or X on the wall, if you will, my feelings about how the Christian church in general has been, when I think about the people that actually get it, 80% of the Christian church worldwide doesn't. And so I saw that. I saw how easy it was in the movie for the church to be subverted against the biblical reality of the Bible. And that's exactly what happened with Mein Kampf. And now they're saying Hitler was the new Jesus and all these things. And they bring that out in the movie. And that was abhorrent to Bonhoeffer because he didn't see that. But it was so easy for the church to fold. And we've seen that throughout history with the Church of England, the Church of Spain, what we're seeing happen in the United States of America, the cultural shift that's happening in the church to please the culture instead of the Word of God. It's like, it's been fluid for me, Dinah, for as long as I've been studying the pogroms and the abuses and all the different things that the church has inflicted upon anything Jewish for over, 1,800 years. And I think the movie kind of represented that all over again. Go ahead.
Well, we have to put it in perspective because, like I said, he wrote voluminously. I mean, there's just tons on, what he expressed during his life. And short as it was, he died at around 45 years. But I think overall, the movie did a really good job. It's complicated. It's a complicated life. And they tried to do the best they could in 2 hours, which is not anywhere near enough time to be able to present it. I thought that the cinematography was fabulous. I mean, it was just so well done. The actors were tremendous, and they were all the main guy's a famous German actor, and he he took the part on. I thought he did a brilliant job. And the only thing I think it would have been hard for some people. I do believe that they wanted to reach as many as they could, and many people who will see the film don't actually know who Bonhoeffer was and don't have any connection to it. So they were trying to tell a story that would be engaging and bring the people in. But it did get a little confusing with some of they weren't clear about who was who. Like I was trying to, at the beginning, I was like, well, where's Martin Niemöller? Because he's a very important part of Bonhoeffer's life. And it took me a little while to kind of figure out who he was and where he was. And names weren't really clear, and I guess they did it by design. Like his brother-in-law, Hans, was actually a Supreme Court justice in Germany. And they didn't really bring out just how important he was. He ended up being a high official in the Abwehr, and that's why he recruited Bonhoeffer as part of the assassination plot. So some of that was a little bit confusing, I have to say. But overall, I really thought they did a tremendous job. And they didn't hold back on Bonhoeffer's faith. And he, spoke directly against the state and his faith in God and his understanding of the scriptures. I was a little disappointed so when Martin Niemöller is the guy some of you may know who said, they came for the trades union members and I wasn't a trades union member. So, I didn't speak for them, and they came for the Catholics and I didn't speak for them. And there's a lot of variations of that quote. And then finally they came for the Jews. I didn't speak for them. And then they came for me and there was no one left to speak. And so that was very powerful, very important. And Niemöller at first had sort of supported the Nazis in the Lutheran Church, but realized they saw the error of his way. So he and Bonhoeffer joined forces, and they formed something called the Confessing Church. Right. And Bonhoeffer then he took under his wing a number of young men and at Finkenwald, and created kind of like a seminary, not like the ones we're used to, and just groomed these guys and prepared them. And they all eventually were killed, murdered by the Nazis. But that relationship, I wished, but again, they didn't have time, but I wish they could have developed a relationship with those boys and Bonhoeffer when he was communicating to them, because the heartbeat of Bonhoeffer was the Jewish people. Like, he studied the Psalms inside out, knew them well, and saw that the Jewish people were the apple of God's eye, and they were, wrote the scriptures. Hello. And the German church at the time would have none of it, even before we see the rise of anti-Semitism. That wasn't part of their worldview. So, I don't want to criticize the movie too much, because I understand how difficult it was to put everything in there. Those were just a couple, some of my thoughts, but it really was beautifully filmed and, heart-wrenching at the end. That last scene was just, that was kind of broke me there. And it was really well worth going to see. And if we don't go support these kind of films, like, why bother? And there's a lot of really terrible movies out right now. So please go support the Bonhoeffer film.
Yeah. Speaking of the movie, because I'm familiar with him touring the South, but they kind of highlighted his time in Harlem, and some of the, the anti-Semitic or the anti-Negro, if I can say it that way, of the day. Bonhoeffer got to see that,
right? And
particularly when they went down south, but they didn't really show a lot of his time down south. But he saw, for the first time, I think, and I think they did a good job with this, is a different kind of church environment in the Black community. And I thought that was kind of interesting.
Yeah, no, I mean, it was transformative for him. Like, these people actually had a real living, exciting relationship with God. And, going in a Black church and singing those songs, it rock'em sock'em, it just changed him completely. And, Adam Clayton Powell Sr. was the pastor of the Harlem Church at that time. Right. And they had a good relationship. And he did go with Frank up to Chicago, which, you'll see in the movie. So he was very much immersed in it, and it just changed him. But he knew, he had gone back to Harlem after going back to Germany, and knew he couldn't stay there, that he had to go back and help his people. And so he made that decision himself to do that.
I think, too, that the movie was trying to say that, during the civil rights movement here in the United States of America, a lot of those white folks that we see marching and Selma and whatnot were Jews. and that's kind of fallen by the wayside. There's so many in the Black community that don't recognize that the Jews are right there standing beside a lot of the Blacks, both in the 1920s and in the 1960s, when it came to this, because they understood it. They've been going through this, not to compare the slave trade with the Holocaust, but I mean, these are two people groups who've gone through hell. I mean, they literally have gone through hell by the system. And I will say this about that. The same anti-Semitism that Bonhoeffer experienced in Germany, the Black folks, they dealt with a different kind of racism or a different kind of hatred, but it was familiar. And they brought that out in the movie, and I was glad to see that happen as well. I went into the movie, Dina, already saddened because I knew the outcome. So I'm sitting through the whole movie saddened, and I'm trying to cheer on his fight. He was all by himself for the most part in his thoughts with why? How can this be happening? And I understood that, because right now today, I'm sitting here going, wow, how can this be happening? How can what's happening in the churches around the globe be happening if, in fact, we stand upon the principles of biblical thought, biblical truth? And yet, we're seeing a repeat in a lot of ways. We just don't have that one ruler. I'm not going to get into the whole thing about national Christianity. That's a subject you could tackle later on. But I'm watching the same kind of, it's like the church is succumbing, and not all, I have to say that, but it's like they're succumbing to a cultural shift. And that's exactly what happened in Germany. It's exactly the same thing.
Well,
and I would like you to speak on that.
Well, Bonhoeffer was clearly disgusted with the theological leaders of the day for their cowardice and their refusal to stand up against the state. I think we find ourselves in the exact same place. He had to wrestle with, he's been accused, and the left has sort of adopted him as sort of the pacifist in chief. And there certainly was a period in which he was, but he realized that, and participated in the plot to kill Hitler. You might be familiar with Valkyrie, with Stauffenberg. He was part of that. He wasn't there, but there were a number of different plots to assassinate Hitler, and they all went south. I mean, if you can even imagine. And the reason, Bonhoeffer himself worked for the Abwehr. He was recruited by his brother-in-law, and he traveled all through Europe trying to gin up support from these other nations for what was, for what was going on in Germany for the Jewish people and really for the confessing church, etc. And what happened is they collected a lot of documents, which they hid. And somehow the Nazis found all of those documents that identified everybody who was in the plot to kill Hitler. And that's the reason he was actually arrested and thrown in the Flossenburg prison and eventually hung. It wasn't because he was a Christian and he supported the Jews so much as it was he was part of that plot. So
the reason why that's important, Dina, because they let him, they really didn't come down on him until after he came back from the United States. But they allowed him to be irreverent against the Nazi Party until the plot to kill Hitler. Then they rounded them all up. And when you were talking about the confessing church, he tutored those boys, according to the information that I read, for 4 years.
Yes.
To stand against what was happening in the church system, and they were all killed.
Exactly.
There was quite a few. They were all murdered.
He went to Norway and he had a seminary going on there as well. Like I said, it was hard for the movie to bring out all of this, but that relationship with those boys that he discipled and mentored, wow. I mean, it was just an amazing dynamic between them, and he prepared them. And then they all went in their different directions, after his guidance, and they stood tall and stood strong. And again, they were all, so this is a period of, this is a period of courage through individuals and not groups. And it never is about groups, because groups, there's that herd thing, and it never stands up against the truth. It doesn't seem like it to me. God seems to always use individuals and raise them up. And I was, thinking about in the, the 1800s, and you have ones like, well, back in the 1700s, George Whitefield, for example, the pastor who rode rain, sleet, snow, or hail, stood out in just terrible conditions and didn't even have a megaphone, and would just preach the gospel. And Jonathan Edwards, The Sinners in the Hands of an Angry God. I just, you just see the evolution of these incredible individuals who have made a difference and who have been cultural influencers of their time. And they're not really in the church. They're outside the church, and God has raised them up. And I was thinking about this in the context of our current situation, just leading up to the election, that the church, you should know that evangelicals did not vote in record numbers like people think. In fact, 8 to 10% less voted this time than the previous election.
I read about that.
Millions did not show up for the usual reasons. And so I feel, this is just my interpretation. I could be completely wrong, but what I saw was people that we identified as cultural influencers who are not connected to the church starting to exhibit their faith and talk about their faith and talk about Jesus, and I'll name a few, and please don't send me hate mail. But it seemed obvious to me, people like Charlie Kirk, who had a tremendous influence on the election, but he began to speak about his faith. And from what I understand is he actually sets apart the Shabbat on Saturday.
Yes, he does.
He speaks openly. We see Tucker Carlson now speaking quite a bit on his faith and his journey. Obviously, people like Eric Metaxas, Dr. Naomi Wolf. She's a Jewish woman. She was very involved in all the COVID stuff, but she had a dynamic relationship. She's Jewish. She had a dynamic relationship with Jesus back many years ago, and she began to talk about that. Of course, we know Glenn Beck. He openly talks, and he's a Mormon. So it just felt that God was pulling out individuals who people knew, who were very influential, and who began to feel comfortable and have courage to talk about their faith in the marketplace. And I don't know how that played out, but it seemed to me to be a very important point as far as God calling individuals for a certain time to do a certain thing. And they weren't from the church.
You know what comes to mind for me when you were addressing all of this? I'm thinking of William Wilberforce, who brought down the slave trade in England 50 years before it was ripped out of the soul of America, so to speak. I think about these giants, but you know what they never are, Dina? I completely agree with you 100%. It's never the collective body of the church,
right?
The gospel believing, hardcore Christian folks. And my thinking about this, in particular after watching the movie, is we don't know enough about the ancient Near East world to make the kind of connections. We have a spiritualized, emotional connection to a story that is completely ripped out of the heart of Israel and turned into a Western theological exegesis hermeneutical conundrum. But I think there is where the problem is, because collectively, if the church understood the apple of God's eyes, this whole concept of anti-Semitism would not exist.
But the
completely
church
believe
doesn't
that.
have the heart for it. It seemed to me over the last number of years that many pastors have been mostly just quiet now, not all, and there's been some great pastors. So,
Right.
you
I agree
understand I'm
too.
generalizing here. But they've not talked about the most important issues of the day. So, I mean, Bonhoeffer did not hold back. I mean, he was, he got up in church with all the Nazis sitting there and the fake church, and gave him what
Yes.
for. I mean, he was, there was no, I mean, he was crystal clear. I feel that a lot of pastors they have failed in that they have not been explaining the cultural realities of the day to their people. So the people don't really even they don't have a biblical understanding, a biblical perspective of the stuff that is going on in our culture. And so, and they're not explaining to them the sort of consequences of, I'm not going to bring up all the different, I could bring up all of this stuff, but you
Yeah. You and
understand
I
what I'm
could too.
saying. There-
I
Our
do.
people in church do not understand these issues and these policies and how they're negatively affecting the entirety of the culture. They just don't want to talk about politics. But these things are impacting all lives, not just their life. And it doesn't really have to be that way. And like I said, Bonhoeffer, he never held back. And that's what I just keep sensing that God has that call on individuals to stand up and speak. So certain pastors have not held back and have, stood up in with courage and grace and pushed back against what I feel is the sort of insulation and isolation and irrelevancy sometimes of the church.
Well, I mean, just like the German church bought the lie of Mein Kampf for the most part, we bought the lie of separation of church and state, which has been a gigantic lie because, in terms of biblical people representing a kingdom of God, we're the ones that are supposed to be in the front line of biblical truth. What's right, what's good, what's wholesome, freedom. I mean, the church, the founders of this nation, and this is the thing that just drives me nuts, and you and I've talked about this numerous times. This growing nation overcame a lot of tyrannical crap as it fought the slave trade and as it became freedom, a clearing call for freedom around the globe. It still had its own sicknesses. And again, we had the Martin Luther Kings, we had the Frederick Douglasses in the Black community, we had the Susan B. Anthonys, and for women, it's always been that individual to stand up and do the right thing. But here in our culture today, if the church wasn't feckless, in my opinion, combating government, it's almost like two competing governments, to be honest with you. But if the church really stood on the biblical principles that came out of the Hebrew world, a lot of the craziness that's going on in the world today would be overnight. It would be ended. But we don't understand the history. I talked to you earlier about, the person who's talking about the gospel message, if he was talking to the disciple wouldn't know what he was talking about. And we don't understand. We're completely disconnected from why they were doing what they were doing. We've made it a church call instead of a kingdom call. And I see governments of the world then and now shutting down anything that has to do with righteousness and freedom. It's been this way for 1,800 years. And again,
Why,
Dina, I want to just conclude that by saying the people that we read about in New Testament would have no concept of what we call church today. And we don't understand that. We don't know that. They wouldn't even be able to have a conversation in line with sharing the gospel message, because that's not what they were doing. That's not the concept they have. I just believe that. And that was literally solidified in my head when I was in Turkey looking at the tyranny that these people were fighting. I'm going, everybody in the Bible was fighting a form of government tyranny. Everybody. Doesn't matter what page you turn to, that's what they were fighting.
Well, that is the history of mankind. It is the history of humanity, that human beings end up falling under the oppression and tyranny of tyrannical leaders over and over and over again, which is what makes, the United States Constitution so amazing, is that the humans, the citizens of America, were given the greatest gift of all, and that was the gift to choose their own leaders.
Right.
Which they have not chosen well of late. But it is a gift. And leadership matters. And leadership helps put restraints on evil. You're either going to have leadership that's out of control and allows evil to flourish, or you're going to have leadership that creates social order and restrains evil. And the church is supposed to be the conscience of the state. The goal of the Bill of Rights was to keep the state out of the church, not the church out of the state. And all the thing, we in this country have really foregone this just tremendous gift and turned it over and said, I'm not going to vote. It's not going to do any good. They just cheat. I understand all that, but we have this incredible gift and responsibility, and to participate in who our leaders are, and to not speak out and to not be the conscience of the state has left us where we are now. We both agree. We feel like we bit the bullet here. We can breathe for a little bit, but honestly, the same stuff's going to continue on, and you have to ask yourself, what am I going to do about it? How can I participate in the responsibility that I've been given to steward the church, to steward our responsibility in what's ahead? The church has just been way too passive and does not understand its own power to affect the changes in the lives of every person that lives here, and not just in the United States, but really all around the world.
Well, Dina, I sit here, and yes, it is very frustrating, because when I'm talking to believers and I go, if you're waiting for Jesus to take the wheel, well, the God that I know of allowed the Jews to drive themselves right into the gas chambers. So if you're waiting for God, who's in control, to fix everything for you, that's not what he asked us to do. He asked us to go out and be responsible, to share the message of his kingdom, and to represent him in the face of tyranny. And every one of the disciples, and they were Jewish, by the way, every one of them suffered death.
Yep. Because
of the mandate to go out and do what? Announce the kingdom of God is now open for the nations to come in. I mean, that's really the gospel message.
Well, and one of the quotes from Bonhoeffer was, "God bids a man to come and die." Yeah.
Yes. So
he understood full well.
I think of Joshua. When I think of Joshua, biblical Joshua, I'm always thinking of a man whose entire life was killing people, clearing the land. He lived a life of death. And I think, these guys were doing something. And again, we're talking about individuals throughout the biblical story, whether we're talking about Hadassah, whether we're talking about Abraham, whether we're talking about Adam, they all were given a commission to do something. So we're not reading the stories about Judaism. We're not reading the stories about Christianity or Zoroastrianism or Apollo and all the Hellenistic world. We're reading the stories about individuals who accepted the responsibility to announce the kingdom of God, probably long after the dinosaurs and everything else that went on before Adam was appointed. But that's what they were doing. They were literally saying, okay, the God of the universe has made himself known to us. Here is the statutes, the commandments, and the laws of how to live free and be part of a thing that he's creating, which is magnificent. The thing I've appreciated the most about America is the entire world moved into this nation because they had the voice, the individual voice, to represent the kind of government that they wanted. That's all gone now. I mean, you and I both, that's gone. I don't know, the last election kind of made me a little happy, but at least we got to fight back. If we're going to take back the land, we have to fight to do it, because that's what everybody in the biblical account was doing. Every one of them. And yet the church today, well, go ahead.
Well, no, you just make the point how God uses individuals. You know, I mean, the Bible is the story of individuals who rose up and, you know, stood out, stepped out, encouraged, and God equipped them, and he was with them, and he led them and guided and directed them, but they got up and went out. And so we're kind of in this sort of state of let's let someone else do it. And
you know what I always hear, and it's so ironic to me. Well, the Jews just didn't get it. I heard it yesterday, and I sit here and I go, then why are you reading the book that they wrote about it? It just defies logic to me. and it defies logic to me, because they're completely removed from the responsibility that provided us with the material.
Yeah.
I mean,
well, again,
that's like the oxymoron of humanity to me.
The church, as brought out in the film as well, is that the duty of the church was to be the conscience of the state. And the duty of Christians was to help people who have been victimized by the state, of which there are many. And so, the victimization by the state against individuals, creating a class of vulnerable and people suffering and abused by the state. Bonhoeffer said that in those circumstances, if the state refuses to heed the conscience or to heed the church, that Christians were required to put a spoke in the wheel of the state. And so, to me, that's just kind of groundbreaking, and we need to apply that today as well. But it's a difficult charge, because people are running scared and they don't want to. They're willing. How should I put it? They're more happy to have peace, which for them equals silence, versus peace, which is going to, turn the world upside down. That's the real peace that turns the world upside down, not being silent and not saying anything, and just, just looking for cover.
When I think of that, what you just said, the first thing that came to my mind was the peace sign of the 1960s turned upside down.
Yeah.
And I sit here and I go, I mean, we're kind of fighting ourselves, because for those of us who absolutely believe in the biblical account, we're fighting the fact that we have to do something. It's like Bonhoeffer says, your faith is worthless if you don't do anything with it. I mean, you got it. What did he say? Not speaking up. You know the quote better.
Silence in the face of evil is itself evil. To speak, to not speak is to speak.
I'm encouraged a little bit, because the pushback against the cultural shift that we've all endured now for the last 40 years, and certainly the last 10, I'm starting to see people pushing back against what is expected of us, and which is counterproductive to just about every voice of freedom there is. And I'm encouraged to see that, but unless the voice of the church I'm talking about the Christian believers. You know, you got a handful over here that are standing up for the biblical principles in the way that Bonhoeffer did. But unless the majority of believers do their own research, go back and look at the legal systems that the church, that the biblical stories were written in, I just feel like you can't ride this wave on emotion and spiritualism all the way to the bus stop. And I know you'll get what I mean by the bus stop. You have to be engaged in making a difference. What is the word? Tohu
Bohu?
Yes. I mean, you have to be involved. That's why I will say this until the end of my life. Your salvation was the beginning of your obligation to reinforce the text and the lifestyle. I just believe that. I really do.
Well, that was Bonhoeffer's mission. I mean, he lived it out, and he showed us what it should look like. I mean, his life is just, even though, you know, he was hung 2 weeks before the Allies.
I know.
You know, you're going, wow, imagine, you know, what I try to imagine what he would think if he saw his life on the scale, worldwide scale, you know, movies and books. And, you know, one of his most important books that people should read is called The Cost of Discipleship. Like, that's just groundbreaking. And that book alone would revolutionize the church if they actually incorporated the principles in it. That's another story. He was not about theology or theological ideas. He recognized the importance of a personal relation, a deep and abiding personal relationship with his Messiah. And he called it, he said we needed to have a religionless Christianity, that we did not need all the trappings and traditions per se of Christianity. We needed that really deep, intimate relationship. And he railed against you know, the leadership of the day, you know, that especially in the church, in the same way that Yeshua, you know, railed against the leadership of his day, the religious of his day, who were, you know, wrapped in their religious traditions. It was just religiosity and stuff that people, the call was for people to live out their faith. And this is the call in every generation. I think, you know, he showed us what real courage looks like. And I'm not, you know, I don't know if I'm ready for the task, but that's what his life is, what courage looks like.
The fact that he was invited to stay in the United States of America, and he said, no, I have to go back. I have to go back and represent what I believe. And, you know, he paid with his life, but his relationship to the God of the Bible, he couldn't for the life of himself understand how the church could slaughter the Jews, round them up, and what he saw. And he said, I have to go back and fight. I have to go back and stand up for these words that have built the church. I have to do that. And he paid with his life. Well, I mean, that's unfortunately, when you're facing tyranny, that's kind of what has to happen in a lot of the instances in order for the differences to be made. People have to give up their lives. And Yeshua proper even said, because of me, you will be scattered again. You will be put to death. You will be persecuted. Of course, he's talking to the Jewish people, not, you know, the Church of Benny Hinn. He's talking to people in relationship to him in the time where he was, which was ancient Israel. And he's saying, you're going to be persecuted because of me. And guess who did most of the persecution? The church.
Well, it's an interesting
church.
Yeah, for sure. An interesting contrast for Bonhoeffer when he did finally come to the United States, because he went to the Theological Union, whatever it's called, in New York, which was just staid and boring and uninspiring and dead, right? Dead theology. And then you see the contrast when he goes to Harlem, to the church in Harlem, and it, just rocks his world. And that was that kind of life is, I mean, if you've ever been to Germany, no offense to the German people, but they're not like an excitable people. Like,
I've
they
never been.
don't have it down there in their soul like a good black gospel church. And they're very formal, kind of like the Swiss, that just barely crack a smile, just everything's. And so even in that time, I try to imagine what that must have been like for him, just to go into that.
Funny story. I went to I was the first one to start going to churches in my family years ago, and I went to a black church in Rochester, New York. For the first time, I was invited to go with family, and this lady, she was pretty big. This was like the church that Bonhoeffer was in. It was lively. Yeah. It was rowdy. Well, this one lady caught the Holy Ghost. Whoa. She knocked over a whole bench. This elderly couple went to the hospital, and I went, man, you can get hurt in this church. So I remembered that, and I wrote about it in my book too. I was like, wow, if this is what the Holy Ghost causes, I don't want nothing to do with this. Because an elderly couple, husband and wife, got taken to the hospital because the lady fell on them. She was big. And I was like, okay, I'm not coming back to this church. This is dangerous.
Well, you would never see that in the German church. And honestly, you would never see that in a synagogue either. So,
well, we've got just a few minutes left. One of the things that just blows my mind, when I read your books, okay, when I met you, the whole, how do I say this? I see the church as a political kind of entity, no matter what denomination you go to. And there's 36,000 plus to choose from. But I see the government structure in the church. My goodness, if you go against the government structure of the church, you're excommunicated out of there. Okay, so it's kind of the same thing. If you go against the political establishment, you're kind of tossed out of this. So I don't see too much of a difference in the two, okay? I really don't. Although I do know that the church and believing in the words of the Bible changed hundreds of lives, thousands, millions of lives, mine included, okay? I just realized in order for me to have a better understanding of this relationship I'm in with the God of the Bible, I need to understand the God of Israel and the people of Israel in that world. So I've been focused on that for the last 10 years, certainly since I've met you. Now, you've written these 3 books. I'm going to put them up on the screen here. Dinah, how are the books selling? This was the first one, The Temple Revealed in Creation. I read this one. I understood it because I was not looking at it through the lens of a creation experience, but rather an appointment or an introduction to the formation of the nation of Israel. That's how I've seen it. Okay. Now with this book right here, and then you came out with this one, The Temple Revealed in the Garden, made more sense to me than anything I've ever heard in any church. Okay. And of course you came out with the Noah book, and that was more of a, guys, the reason that happened is for the same reasons we're living in today. I mean, you were able to tie that whole flood experience to, and I use the word flood experience, to the temple, first of all, but also to what caused it in the first place. How are the books selling now? We've got just a few minutes left. How are you doing with these books?
So the first book came out in 2016, then 18, and then 21. So it's been, 8 years, right, since the first book. I sell pretty well, anywhere from 50 to 100 books every month on Amazon. And I know, it's gone far and wide. I see people from Australia, India, Italy, Romania, all over the world, people purchase them. And they are also translated into Spanish. So lately, for whatever reason, a lot of Spanish books have been sold as well. So, and then what I did was I took the 3 books and I wrote a course for the 3 books, which I teach usually 2 or 3 times a year. I take a bunch of students and we go through. It's a 12-step program. And and try to give them that foundation.
Okay.
And have had a tremendously wonderful response to that. That sort of kept me going. And I'm actually now working on another book. I just started fairly recently. I felt like it was time to start another book, and it's going to be called, I think, The Greatest Exodus, not the Greater Exodus, but The Greatest Exodus, using all of these themes and principles and built from the ancient Near East world to show the Exodus story in the New Testament, particularly in the Gospel of Matthew, somewhat in Mark. I want people to see that the story is in the Gospels. And if you eliminate the story and say that God's done away with the Torah, God's done away with the Old Testament, I don't need to read the Old Testament, you have completely missed the whole gospel story, because the gospel story is the greatest Exodus.
Right.
And so I feel ready to start on that. Again, I've been working. It's going to take me a while, but all of these books have at the heart is to help you understand the ancient Near East culture and world and language and history and identity and all of that, in order to be able to engage the Bible and help it make sense.
Well, when I read the books, it was like doing somersaults, because the religious component, the spiritual component, the emotional component was more humanized, as opposed to this fantastical biblical story. I mean, I could actually understand Adam and what he dealt with. I could see Abraham wondering, what's going on? What does all of this amount to? And then the realization of the nation of Israel born. And I went, this story is, you made the story human and relatable, because we're a product of that world, not a new idea. And what I'm always saying, give the story back to the writer and the culture, so that you can understand how we even came into being as a result of what those folks were doing. And particularly when the God of Israel began to reveal himself to a select group of people throughout the story of the Bible. I mean, it's just amazing to me.
Yeah. So that select group of people would take that story to all of humanity, so that in the end, all humanity would come and approach and worship the God of Israel. And God's goal has always been to elevate humanity, to give humans value and dignity. And that the story of Israel was to show how much God valued their lives, their humanity, their humanness. And,
Right.
we sometimes we forget about that part. And really the story is a bigger story than we understand. But he used this people called Israel to bring that story to the whole world. And like you said, it's a kind of a Jewish story,
Well, the entire Bible to me is God revealing himself through a people called Israel that he created by pouring his identity into them. And I just get that. Folks, we're just coming up on the last moment of our show. Dinah, thank you for coming on again. You're always open invitation anytime. Go see the movie, folks. The movie Bonhoeffer, I think it's done really well. I think the actor who played Bonhoeffer did a good job. I think the movie tells a story. You get a little peek. And I think the bigger story is, what's the church going to do in a situation like that, should it happen again? Were you going to stand like Bonhoeffer did, or are we going to succumb to another Hitler? That's the question that we all have to ask. So this is Jeff. Thanks again, Dinah. Glad to have you on board.
Thank
Jeff,
you.
let's talk about it, guys. By the way, this program is for you. It's about you. If you want to come on and you have a story to talk, I don't care. I'm not a him, she, or her. That kind of stuff. I don't know how to have that conversation. But if you have a story to tell that helps people, please let me know. We'll come on and we'll talk about it. Okay, this is Jeff Morton. Have a great Sunday. Bye-bye.